growing up in Minnesota, just if you could spend a second on your family, because as popular and as brilliant and as great as you and your brother are, John's okay. I mean, you're certainly the star.
Yeah, John's just a guy. I mean,
he's all right. but it's about your father, because when I first learned about you, it was really the person making an introduction was talking about how brilliant your father was. And if you can spend a second on him and what his influence was, I just think that's helpful for people to get behind the curtain and see the human side of things.
Absolutely. And I have one of my very best friends, actually, he's a president of Morgan Stanley, and he's a guy who does help me with my portfolio. And he was a football player with me at the University of Minnesota back in the day. I recruited him, and he's done really well in the financial world. He's been there for a really long time. And he always likes to joke with people and say, hey, you see Pete over there? He's got a pretty decent Wikipedia page, a couple pages long. He's got like 4 or 5 pages. His father's got 70. And I always laugh because I'm smart enough to know that I'm just a guy. I do what I do. I enjoy what I do. It's fun. I enjoy life, and hopefully people see that. But, my dad was a really special guy. And my mom, who doesn't get nearly enough credit, was a really special woman. And she was a surgical nurse. She met my father while she was trying to travel the rest of the world. And she stopped in San Francisco, where he was offered the chief of surgery at the University of San Francisco, and instead got recruited around the country, went to the University of Minnesota. He actually is one of the pioneers in transplantation. And this is a guy who in college, he graduated in 2.5 years. He was in med school when he went to play football in the Rose Bowl. He got drafted by the Chicago Bears. I mean, it's too bad he wasn't much of an achiever. And then he played semi-pro football for a while to pay for his bills while he was in medical school. The guy is just unbelievable. And for a very long period of time, he might still have it. He had the highest MCAT score ever to get into medical school. The guy just a miraculous guy who came as his parents were immigrants from Armenia when there was a Turkish invasion and all the rest of that. They moved to the United States. And one of the things that his mother did, and I respect her for doing it, I'm a little sad because none of us really know how to speak Armenian, because they wanted to become Americans right away. And with that, speak English only. And so my dad and his brothers, who were all football players at the University of California, Berkeley, they all spoke just English for the most part. They could speak some Armenian because there was a little bit that would rub off here and there, but that was about it. But yeah, my dad was a special guy. And part of this, it being a special guy, was not only did he accomplish so many things, he came up with the immunosuppressant drug that everybody in the world used for about 50 years for transplantation. So if that wasn't enough, he trained everybody around the world. I worked in his research labs at one point in time during the off seasons of football for me, because I always wanted to become a surgeon myself. And I just didn't get there because I was lucky enough to play football just long enough to not really get into the saying at 30 years old, I want to be a med student. So that slowed it down a little bit for me. And I got onto the Chicago Board Options Exchange with my brother, John, who had a brief stint with the Chicago Bears. So, but my dad, just a special guy. And one of the things I would also say about him, just to recap him a little bit more, would be he was not that guy who would walk around with the rest of the doctors around the hospital and try to pretend like, he's one of these untouchable guys. My dad was 6'4", 285-pound man. He had the biggest hands. His hands were so big. They're bigger than Michael Jordan's. I know that because he put it on the Michael Jordan thing in front of the United Center in Chicago. But his hands were so big, he had to have special gloves made to be able to fit onto his hands. I mean, he's just a monster of a man who had an unbelievable heart. And he was also the guy who he was more interested in asking the janitor about his kids and what they were doing in school rather than standing around talking to the other surgeons about a case that they were working on. He is just an interesting guy. And outside of that, I think I told you this story, but he was the ringside physician for Hulk Hogan. And so we'd go to WWE matches all the time. Back then it was WWF or whatever.
Yeah.
Here's this guy who's one of the smartest minds ever in surgery, and yet he's willing to go and not care what people think. He's in the front row for the Vikings, the basketball with the Timberwolves. We weren't real hockey fans because none of us really grew up, even though in Minnesota we know it's the state of hockey, but we weren't there. But every other sport that he had tickets for, we would sit front row because he always wanted to be right there. Not so he'd be seen. He wants to just be there.
Yeah.
And would oftentimes tell me when he'd come to my games or when he and I would be on a sideline, he'd say, I still think I got it. I've always said this, you want your surgeon who's going to do the work on you to be a very confident man. And my dad was not an egotist, but he certainly was confident beyond words. And I always loved that about him because he would literally look at me and go, I think I could play 5 or 6 plays in a game. Just get down there.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was always fun. He's a great guy to grow up around.